By the beginning of its second winter of war, Free France was no longer, in the eyes of world public opinion, the reckless and surprising enterprise which had originally aroused irony, pity, or tears. It was now everywhere confronted as a real factor, and this reality manifested itself politically, militarily, and territorially. Henceforth, Free France had to prove itself in the diplomatic sphere, to win its rightful place among the Allies and to appear before them as a sovereign and belligerent France, whose rights were to be respected and whose contribution to victory was to be taken into account. This goal I intended to achieve gradually. But I was neither willing nor able to concede the essentials. Moreover, I was in a hurry to take a firm and definitive stand before the last decisive blow could determine the outcome of the war. Consequently, there was no time to lose, especially with regard to the great powers of Washington, Moscow, and London. The United States brings elementary feelings and complex politics to great affairs, so it was manifested in 1941 in their position toward France. While in the depths of American public opinion General de Gaulle's enterprise elicited enthusiastic responses, the whole of official America felt obliged to regard it with coldness or indifference. U.S. officials consistently maintained relations with the Vichy government, believing that by doing so they were fighting against German influence over France and preventing the extradition of her fleet. American statesmen maintained contact with Weygand, Nogues, and Buisson. Roosevelt expected them to one day open the gates of Africa to him. But thanks to a surprising contradiction, the policy of the United States, which had its representatives under Pétain, was to alienate Free France on the pretext that it could not be foreseen in advance what kind of government the French people would install when they were free again. In essence, the leaders of American politics believed that France had already ceased to be a great power. They therefore tolerated the Vichy government. If in some points they still did not exclude the possibility of cooperation in order to fight this or that French power, they regarded it as occasional and local agreements. Under these conditions, it was difficult for us to reach an agreement with Washington. In addition, Roosevelt's personal attitude also complicated matters. Although I had not yet had occasion to meet Franklin Roosevelt, I could guess from many indications that he was very reticent toward me. Nevertheless, I wanted to do everything in my power to ensure that the United States, which was preparing to go to war, and France, which I claimed had never stopped war, would not go their separate ways. As to the form of the relations to be established, and about which diplomats, politicians, and publicists have argued eagerly, I must say that at the moment it was of almost no importance to me. The real nature and content of our relations were of immeasurably greater importance to me than all the alternating formulas into which Washington lawyers clothed the fact of recognition. But in view of the vast American resources and Roosevelt's tendency to command and dictate his will throughout the world, I felt that our independence was clearly in danger. In short, if I were to make an attempt to negotiate with Washington, all these things had to be taken into account, but the negotiations had to be conducted on an equal footing. During the heroic period of the early months of Free France, Giraud Dombasle and Jacques de Sagies had propagated our views to great advantage for our cause. It was now a question of entering into negotiations. I entrusted Pleven with their preparation. He knew America well and was a dexterous man. He was fully aware of our affairs. In May 1941, I gave him the following assignment from Brazzaville: to achieve the restoration of permanent and direct relations with the State Department, to establish economic relations of free French Africa and Ocherie with America, and to settle the question of direct procurement of everything necessary for the war. Then to organize in the United States our information and propaganda, to establish our committees, and to establish assistance from Americans sympathetic to us. Pleven, who went to America at the beginning of June, did not come there empty-handed. We immediately proposed to the United States to establish air bases in Cameroon, Chad, and the Congo, because Africa, as if by nature, was intended to serve as a springboard for action in Europe when the Americans take up arms. Moreover, given the Japanese threat, the help that could be given them by the islands in the Pacific, where the flag with the cross of Lorraine flew, was also of considerable importance to them. Indeed, the American government was not slow to ask us to grant it the right for its aircraft to use some of our African bases, and then bases in the New Hebrides and New Caledonia, since the United States was not yet in the position of a belligerent power. This request came from Pan American Airways, although no one doubted the true meaning of the request. As the United States saw the hour of war approaching for it, Washington showed us more and more attention. In August, an American liaison mission headed by Colonel Cunningham was sent to Chad territory. In September, Cordell Hall publicly declared that the American government and Free France had a community of interest. "From every point of view we have," he said, "good relations with this group." On October 1, Cleveland was formally received at the State Department by Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles. On November 11, President Roosevelt, in a letter to Stettinius, extended the Lend-Lease Act to Free France, because the defense of the territories joining Free France has vital interests for the defense of the United States. Later that month, Weygand's withdrawal from Algiers dispelled American illusions that Washington did not yet know what to replace. As Cleveland was at this time returning to London to join the National Committee which I had just established, Adrian Tixier, director of the International Labour Bureau, was placed at the head of our delegation to Washington with the consent of the State Department. Finally, in London itself, normal relations were established between us and Drexel Biddle, the United States ambassador to the governments which had taken refuge in Great Britain. At the same time as the first official relations were being established, the tone of the American press and radio, which had hitherto been unfriendly or altogether silent toward us, was also changing. On the other hand, also among the French emigrants, some of whom were very famous, there was a desire to join with us who held high the banner of the motherland. Thus, for example, Professor Fauquion, founding the French Institute in New York, around which prominent representatives of French science, historians and philosophers grouped themselves, obtained the consent of his colleagues to ask General de Gaulle to recognize his organization by a special decree. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7 plunged America into war. One might have supposed that henceforth she would regard Free France, which had fought a common enemy, as her ally. However, nothing of the sort happened, before Washington finally made up its mind to do so. Many difficult vicissitudes had to be endured. On December 13, for example, the American government requisitioned the steamship Normandy and 13 other French vessels in its ports, without bothering to negotiate with us or even to notify us of their use and armament. A few weeks later, the Normandy caught fire under tragic circumstances. During December, an Act of the United Nations was discussed and signed by 27 nations, but we were not among them. That the attitude toward us on the part of the United States was not only strange, but not even quite sincere, was soon shown by one incident, which in itself was quite insignificant, but to which official circles in Washington attached great importance. It is possible that to some extent this incident was caused by myself to ascertain the attitude, just as one throws a stone into a pond to ascertain its depth. It was a question of annexing the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. The thought had been on our minds from the very beginning. Indeed, it was shameful that a stone's throw from Newfoundland, a small French archipelago, whose population was in favour of joining us, was held under Vichy rule. The British were in favour of annexation because they feared that German submarines operating in waters through which sea caravans passed could receive intelligence transmitted by radio from the island of Saint-Pierre. But, they said, the consent of Washington was necessary for the islands to join us. Personally, I considered such consent, though desirable, was not necessary, since in this case it was a matter of internal French affairs. My determination to annex this archipelago was strengthened by the fact that Admiral Robert, the Vichy High Commissioner in the Antilles, Guiana and Saint-Pierre, was negotiating with the Americans, which could not but lead to the neutralization of these French territories under the protection of Washington. Having received information in December that Admiral Gorn was sent by Roosevelt to Fort-de-France to negotiate with Robert on the terms of neutralization of our possessions in America and the ships that were there, I decided to act at the first opportunity. Such an occasion presented itself in the person of Admiral Muselier. He was going to Canada to inspect the cruiser submarine Surcouf, which was then based at Halifax, as well as the French corvettes which escorted the naval caravans. I agreed with him in principle that he would carry out this operation as well. Indeed, having concentrated on Halifax, in addition to the Surcouf, corvettes Mimosa, Aconite and Alice, he was already preparing to sail on December 12 to the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. But beforehand, on his own initiative, he decided to obtain in Ottawa the consent of the Canadians and Americans. Thus the secret was given out. I was forced to urgently notify the British of my plans to avoid the impression that I was hiding the operation from them. Washington directed his ambassador at Ottawa to give Muselier a negative reply. The Admiral then stated that he refused to go to the islands. I personally was informed by the London government that for its part it agreed, but that in view of American opposition, it asked us to postpone the operation. Under such circumstances, there was nothing left but to resign ourselves to it, at least until another opportunity presented itself. And the opportunity presented itself. A few hours after this request had been communicated to me by the Foreign Office, it also informed us, was this not done with intent? That the Canadian government, with the consent if not the instigation of the United States, had decided to land on the island of St. Pierre, even by armed force if necessary, appropriate personnel to maintain the radio stations. We immediately protested in London and in Washington, but as soon as the question of foreign intervention on French territory arose, any hesitation seemed to me inadmissible. I immediately ordered Admiral Muselier to annex immediately the islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon. The Admiral did it on Christmas Eve. The population of the islands met the annexation with universal jubilation, and not a single shot was fired. A plebiscite showed that Free France was supported by a large majority of the population. The youth immediately joined our ranks, and the middle-aged men formed a detachment for the defence of the island's Savary, appointed administrator, succeeded the governor. It was hoped that the Americans would sanction without objection this minor operation so successfully carried out. Discontent in the offices of the State Department, a harsher reaction, we suppose, could not have been forthcoming. The incident, however, created a veritable storm of indignation in the United States. It was raised by Cordell Hall himself, announcing in a communique that he was cutting short his Christmas vacation and returning urgently to Washington. The operation carried out in the islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon by the ships of the so-called Free French, said the Secretary of State, was carried out without the knowledge and consent of the United States. He ended the communique by stating that the American government had inquired of the Canadian government what measures it intends to take to restore the status quo ante in the islands. For a full 3 weeks, the unimaginable newspaper hype continued in the United States. The excitement of public opinion went beyond all bounds. The incident suddenly presented American public opinion with an opportunity to choose between official policy, which was still oriented toward Pétain, and the feelings of many who leaned toward de Gaulle. As far as we ourselves were concerned, having achieved our goal, we now expected Washington to come to a more reasonable understanding of things in war. As Churchill was at this time conferring at Quebec with Roosevelt, I telegraphed to the English Prime Minister to notify him of the unfavourable impression made on French public opinion by the position taken in this matter by the State Department. Churchill replied to me that he would do everything in his power to see that the incident was settled. But at the same time, he hinted that some favourable opportunities had deteriorated because of the incident. At the same time, Tixier conveyed reassuring explanations on my behalf to Cordell Hall, while Russie de Sale used all his authority with the American press in the same direction. We endeavoured also to enlist the support of Bullitt, the last American ambassador to France, who was then at Cairo. The Washington government, which had been severely criticised in its own country and had evoked the silent condemnation of England and Canada, was finally compelled to reconcile itself to the fact. Before agreeing to this, however, Washington attempted to resort to intimidation through the mediation of the English government. But the mediator himself was not very convinced of the rightness of his mission. On January 14, Eden met with me twice and only pretended to insist that we agree to the neutralization of the islands, to the independence of their administration vis-à-vis the National Committee, and to Allied control on the spot. As I refused to accept these proposals, Eden informed me that the United States intended to send a cruiser and 2 destroyers to the island of St. Pierre. How will you proceed in such an event? He asked me. The Allied ships will stop at the edge of French territorial waters, and the American admiral will go to breakfast with Muselier, who will, of course, be delighted. And if the cruiser enters territorial waters, our ships will give the proper warning. And if it doesn't stop, that would be a great misfortune, because in that case ours will fire. Eden splashed his hands. I understand your anxiety, I told him finally with a smile, but I have faith in democratic powers. There was nothing left to do but to put a stop to it. On January 19, Cordell Hall received Tixier, and without any apparent displeasure began to develop before him the fundamentals of his policy, which he had followed up to the present time. A little later, he also took note of the reply I had sent him. On January 22, Churchill, returning to England, asked me to visit him. I was at his place with Pleven, the Prime Minister with whom Aden was with him, offered us, on behalf of Washington, London, and Ottawa, an agreement by which everything remained in the islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon in the position which had been created there after their annexation. But in return for this, we were to agree to have the three governments publish a communique which would in some measure save the prestige of the State Department, after which the English minister told us no one will interfere in the matter any longer. We agreed. No communique, however, was published. We retained the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, and all talk on the part of the Allies on the subject ceased. However, whatever the legal position of Washington, whatever their feelings toward us, the entry of the United States into the war compelled them to cooperate with Free France. Above all, this had to be done in the Pacific, where, in view of the lightning advance of the Japanese, our possessions in New Caledonia, as well as the Marquesas Islands, the Tuamotu Islands, the Society Islands, and even Tahiti, could one day play an essential part in the strategic designs of the Allies. Some of these islands had already been used as air and naval bases. In addition, the Allies were very interested in the Caledonian nickel, which was of great importance for the production of armaments, and the Americans realized the benefits of an agreement with us. These benefits were mutual, for in case of danger we alone would not be able to defend our islands. The National Committee therefore decided, on its own initiative and in advance, to accede to all American requests for our possessions in the Pacific, but on the sole condition that they would respect the sovereignty of France and our authority. Above all, however, it was necessary that this authority should be properly exercised on the ground. This was not easy, in view of the extreme remoteness and dispersion of our island possessions, as well as the lack of means, and of the character of the population, although very attached to France, as they had proved by their accession to us, but, on the other hand, restless and easily susceptible to intrigues caused by local and foreign interests. Moreover, of the mobilized elements of the population, most of the best soldiers left Ogier at my orders to fight in Africa in the ranks of the armed forces of Free France. Thus, for instance, the fine and valiant Pacific Battalion and other units were sent to the east under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Broche. Of course, this participation of our possessions in Oceania in the battles for the liberation of France assumed a special significance, but the immediate defense of our islands in the Pacific suffered from it. Finally, wartime events completely disorganized the economic life of these distant possessions. In general, it was necessary to create in Oceania as centralized and strong power as possible. In the spring of 1941, when Leclerc annexed Cameroon, I decided to send Governor-General Bruno, who was out of office, on an inspection trip to Oceania. But Bruno had clashes, and sometimes very sharp ones, with our officials, who accused him, and perhaps not without reason, of seeking with his friends to oust them. Papeete became the scene of tragicomic incidents. There it was possible, for instance, to observe how the governor, the secretary-general, and the English consul were arrested on Bruno's orders. At the same time, in Noumea, Governor Soto treated Bruno with open distrust. Emergency measures had to be taken. In July 1941, I appointed Captain Thierry d'Argentieu as High Commissioner of our possessions in the Pacific, with all civil and military powers. He was charged with the duty to fully and decisively restore the authority of Free France, to use for war purposes all the resources available there, and, acting in conjunction with the Allies, to ensure the defence of French territories in connection with the possible emergence of an imminent threat. I had full confidence in d'Argentieu. His nobility and firmness of character made this man capable of overcoming all intrigues. His ability as a commander was the best guarantee that all our means would be applied with due vigour and knowledge. He had now a place to apply his great diplomatic abilities. By his character and, if I may say so, by his vocation, he understood the struggle of Free France as a kind of crusade and quite rightly believed that this crusade must be carried out skillfully. The light cruiser Triomphant and the messenger vessel Chevre were placed at the disposal of the High Commissioner of the Pacific Possessions. D'Argentieu set about putting things in order, beginning with the island of Tahiti. Celle was appointed governor, while Bruno and his victims were sent to London to explain themselves. And as the situation throughout the Far East continued to deteriorate, d'Argentieu realized that to his original assignment had to be added the duty of coordinating the activities of our representatives in Australia, New Zealand and China, as well as in Hong Kong, Singapore, Manila and Batavia. At the same time, Escara, already renowned among the Chinese as a lawyer and specialist in international law, went to Chongqing to re-establish contact with Marshal Chiang Kai-shek to prepare the restoration of official relations. Suddenly, in early December, the fires of war swept across the Pacific. After a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor with terrible consequences, the Japanese landed in British Malaya, in the Netherlands Indies, in the Philippines, and took possession of Guam, Wake, and Hong Kong. In early January, they surrounded the British Army in Singapore, which was soon forced to surrender. At the same time was occupied Manila. MacArthur was besieged at Bataan. What I knew about this general gave me great respect for him. One day I went to John Winant, United States Ambassador to London, an intelligent and honourable diplomatist, and stated to him as follows: "As a soldier and an ally, I am obliged to tell you that the loss of MacArthur would be a great misfortune. There are not many first-class military commanders in our camp. He is one of them. We must not lose him. But we shall inevitably lose him unless the government orders him to leave Bataan in person by motorboat and then transfer to a seaplane. I believe that such an order should be given, and I beg you to communicate my opinion on the subject to President Roosevelt. I do not know whether my intervention had any effect on the decision made with regard to MacArthur, but some time later I was glad to learn that MacArthur had succeeded in reaching Melbourne. At the end of December, the threat loomed over New Caledonia. The situation was further aggravated by the fact that New Caledonia covered Australia, the main object of the enemy's attack. Meanwhile, on December 22, anticipating the occupation by the Japanese of our islands in Oceania, Vichy appointed Admiral Decouvercovnoy Commissioner of French possessions in the Pacific Ocean, wishing, no doubt, with the support of the aggressor to return our possessions under its authority. The Admiral did not cease to call on the Saigon radio the population of New Caledonia to revolt against Free France. At the same time, D'Argentieu, who had to overcome all sorts of difficulties and endure troubles, sent me reports full of energy, but not very encouraging. As for me personally, and never ceasing to express to him my confidence that he could at least save the honour of France, I gave orders to send to Noumea some of the reserves we had at our disposal. The command staff, the naval guns, the auxiliary cruiser Cap de Palmy, and finally the Surcouf, which could be expected to act effectively in the Pacific, because of its qualities as a submarine of long range. But alas, on the night of February 20, at the entrance to the Panama Canal, this largest submarine in the world collided with a merchant steamer and went down with her commander, Captain Second-Rank Blazon, and a crew of 130 men. Under the influence of events, however, our cooperation with the Allies began to improve. On January 15, the State Department sent a memorandum to our delegation in Washington specifying the commitments made by the United States with regard to respect for our sovereignty in the French Pacific Islands and the fact that the bases and equipment which the Americans would be permitted to establish would remain the property of France. France was recognized as having a right of reciprocity in American territory if American bases were retained after the war. On January 23, Cordell telegraphed me that the American and British Chiefs of General Staff, conscious of the importance of New Caledonia, have taken appropriate measures for its defence in accordance with the terms of the memorandum of January 15. The Secretary of State kindly expressed the hope that the splendid assistance and cooperation which have been rendered in the past by the French High Commissioner will be continued. These excellent declarations were followed by practical measures. On February 25, I had occasion to inform D'Argentieu that General Patch, who had been appointed commander of the American land forces in the Pacific Zone, had received orders from his government to proceed to Noumea and directly, and in the most friendly spirit, to arrange with him for the organization of a general command. On March 6, the French National Committee was invited to send a representative to the Pacific Military Committee established in London for the purpose of exchanging information and proposals, which included representatives of Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. On March 7, the American government asked our permission to establish bases on Tuamotu and in the Society Islands. We agreed to this. Finally, on March 9, General Patch arrived in Noumea at the head of a large force. Henceforth, the French possessions in the Pacific had every opportunity of avoiding invasion. But before the cooperation between our allies and ourselves could be properly established, a serious crisis had to be overcome. At first, there was complete harmony between Patch and D'Argentieu. But soon the presence of American troops, the availability of dollars, and the activities of American secret agents among a population seized with siege fever began to strengthen the latent causes of unrest. A portion of the militia, influenced by local nationalistic aspirations, refused to obey the High Commissioner and came under the command of General Patch, who erred in patronizing such insubordination. On the other hand, Governor Soto, unwilling to obey Sergeant Liu, sought in every way to gain popularity in order to use it for his own purposes. I endured for some time, but then I could not bear it, and summoned Soto to London to give him another appointment, however quite in accordance with the services he had rendered. At first he resolved to obey the order, but subsequently, citing the discontent which the order he had received would arouse among the people, he took the liberty of postponing his departure. In the most courteous manner, but with the necessary firmness, Governor Soto was taken to the ship, that he might obey the order and report to me. Colonel Monchant was sent from the territory of Chad in his stead, and Colonel de Conchard was sent from London to take command of the troops. At Noumea and in the interior of the island, however, serious disturbances took place, encouraged by the position taken by the Americans, foreseeing that events might take an unpleasant turn. I warned Washington of what was happening, and at the same time let Patch know that we could not allow him to interfere in internal French affairs. At the same time, I suggested to Dodge and Pugh that every effort should be made to re-establish with Patch personal relations based on trust, and to show, if possible, some signs of encouragement to a population evidently in an extreme state of agitation. After 3 days of unrest, order reigned again, and Sergeant Liu could take the levers of government into his own hands. This was very opportune, for on May 6 at Corregidor and May 10 at Mindanao surrendered the remnants of American troops in the Philippines, while in the Coral Sea, which washes the northeastern shores of Australia, between the fleets of Japan and the United States, a naval battle, on the outcome of which depended on everything. Noumea could be attacked at any hour. In the face of imminent danger, the population rallied around the French authorities, denouncing the recent riots. Some restless elements were sent to serve in Syria. Patch, for his part, visited Sergeant Liu to apologize to him for the misunderstandings in which he had been involved. I telephoned to the American general that he was assured of my full confidence and that of Free France, provided he acted hand in hand with the French High Commissioner. After this, the Americans and French really began to work amicably and decided to take up the defense together. But circumstances were such that they did not have to defend themselves, for the Japanese, defeated in the Coral Sea, had to abandon their attack on Australia and New Caledonia. So the war forced the United States to maintain ever closer relations with us. It must be said that their national feeling contributed to this. In the midst of the crusade which the American people were inspired to undertake by their innate idealism, and amidst the tremendous efforts of arming and mobilization which they had decided to undertake, the Free French fighters never lost popularity in the eyes of American public opinion. This was to affect U.S. policy as well. In February 1942, we had the opportunity to supplement our representation in Washington with a military mission, at the head of which I placed Colonel de Chavignac. On March 1, America recognized in a public declaration that the French islands in the Pacific were under the effective control of the French National Committee, that the United States government had been negotiating and would continue to negotiate with the authorities which exercise that control. As for Equatorial Africa, the State Department stated in its communique of April 4 that even there it recognized the authority of Free France. At the same time, an American consulate general was established in Brazzaville with our consent. Since the United States asked us for permission to use the airfield at Pointe-Noire as a base for its heavy bombers, we consented on condition that 8 Lockheed planes be given to us for our use. After difficult negotiations, the planes were handed over to us, allowing Colonel Marmir to establish regular air service on the Brazzaville-Damascus line, and for American planes to use Pointe-Noire as an intermediate base. Relations between us and the Americans improved, and we in no way compromised the interests of France, and even on the contrary, strengthened them in every possible way. While step by step, and not without difficulty, we achieved diplomatic rapprochement between Washington and Free France, with Moscow we managed to establish Allied relations immediately. It must be said that this was greatly facilitated in consequence of Hitler's attack, which placed Russia in mortal danger. On the other hand, the Soviets became convinced of the senselessness of the policy by virtue of which they had concluded treaties with Germany in 1917 and in 1939, turning their backs on France and England. The Kremlin leaders, who were thrown into extreme confusion by Hitler's aggression, immediately and irrevocably changed their position, and if even at the very moment when the German tanks crossed the Russian border, the radio in Moscow continued to brand the British imperialists and their Degolevsky mercenaries, then just an hour later Moscow radio stations were already praising Churchill and de Gaulle. In any case, the fact that Russia was drawn into the war opened before the defeated France new great hope. It was clear that if the Reich did not immediately destroy the army of the Soviets, this army will continuously inflict heavy losses on the Germans. Of course, I had no doubt that if the Soviets made a major contribution to the achievement of victory over the enemy, new dangers would arise in the world as a result. One had to keep this in mind at all times, even while fighting the Russians side by side. But I believed that before philosophizing, it was necessary to win the right to live, that is, to win, and Russia's participation created opportunities for victory. In addition, its presence in the camp of the Allies meant from the point of view of the fighting France some counterbalance in relation to the Anglo-Saxon countries, and I meant to take advantage of this circumstance. I learned of the outbreak of hostilities between the Russians and the Germans on June 23, 1941, in Damascus, where I arrived after our troops entered the city. The decision was taken by me without delay. Already on June 24, I telegraphed the following instructions to our representative office in London, without entering at present into a discussion of the vices and even crimes of the Soviet regime. We must, like Churchill, declare that since the Russians are waging war against the Germans, we are unreservedly with them. It is not the Russians who are suppressing France. It is not they who are occupying Paris, Reims, Bordeaux, Strasbourg, German planes and tanks. German soldiers who are being and will be destroyed by the Russians will no longer be able to prevent us from liberating France. In this spirit, I proposed to conduct our propaganda. At the same time, I recommended that our delegation visit the Soviet ambassador in London, Maisky, and tell him in my name that the French people support the Russian people in the struggle against Germany. In this connection, we would like to establish military cooperation with Moscow. Cassine and Dijon met with Maisky, who spoke to them very kindly. As for further practical steps, they were not slow to follow thanks to the soon-to-occur break between Vichy and Moscow, which Hitler demanded from In this connection, on August 2, I telegraphed from Beirut to Cassine and Dijon to find out from Maisky whether Russia intends to maintain direct relations with us and whether she does not expect to send us a declaration of her intention to help restore the independence and greatness of France. It would be desirable that the territorial integrity of France should also be mentioned. The negotiations led to an exchange of letters between myself and Maisky on September 26. The Soviet ambassador made a statement on behalf of his government that it recognizes me as the head of all free Frenchmen, that it is ready to establish communication with the Defense Council of the French Empire on all questions relating to cooperation with the overseas territories that have joined me, that it is ready to give the free Frenchmen all possible help and assistance in the common struggle, that it is determined to ensure the full restoration of the independence and greatness of France. However, the Soviet government, like the British in the agreement of August 7, 1940, did not mention a word about the territorial integrity of France. A little later, the Soviet government accredited Bogomolov as its representative to the National Committee. Bogomolov came from Vichy, where he had been ambassador to Pétain for a year. He was able to adapt easily to the new conditions under which he was to carry out his duties. I never, however, heard from his lips any unkind remarks about Pétain or the ministers of Vichy, where he was still unexpectedly representing his government. In one of our conversations, he even told me the following. While in Vichy, I sometimes spent my leisure time strolling incognito outside the town and conversing with the common people. Some peasant, walking behind a plough, said to me, "Of course, it is a great pity that the French have been defeated. But take this field, for example. I can work on it as I managed to agree with the Germans not to take it away from me. You will see that it will soon be possible to arrange with them to get them out of France altogether." I thought that Bogomolov had given this story, illustrating the theory of sword and shield, to show me how well he understood the situation in France, and at the same time to explain to me the successive changes in the position of Soviet Russia. From that time on I met Bogomolov frequently. Insofar as in every detail his prescribed behaviour allowed him to preserve his human feelings, he displayed them in all his dealings and utterances. Reluctant, wary, and all collected when he delivered or received official messages, this man of great culture was otherwise affable and at ease. Talking about business and people, he was no stranger to humour and even a smile. My acquaintance with him convinced me that although the Soviet system clothed its servants in an iron shell without a single hole, under this shell there was still a living person. For our part, we sent General Petit to Moscow to liaise on military matters. The Soviet government immediately showed him its favour and respect. He was invited to meetings at headquarters, a trip to the front was organised, and he was received by Stalin. All this made me think that this caution was not only for professional purposes. In any case, the news coming from various sources gave the impression that the Russian armies, which had suffered damage in the first battles with the advancing Germans, gradually regained their strength, that the entire nation was rising to the fight, and that in these days of national threat Stalin, who had elevated himself to the rank of marshal and never again parted with the military uniform, tried to speak not so much as a plenipotentiary representative of the regime, but as the leader of the eternal Russia. On the walls of our offices hung maps, on which we followed the grand battle and watched the development of the giant offensive operations of the Germans. 3 army groups under the command of von Lieb, von Bockay von Rundstedt for 4 months, penetrated deep into Russia, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners and rich booty. But in December, on the outskirts of Moscow, thanks to the decisive actions of Zhukov, which favoured the harsh and early winter, the invaders were stopped and then thrown back. Leningrad did not fall. Sevastopol was still holding out. It became obvious that Hitler failed to impose on the German command the only strategy that could only bring decisive success, namely, the concentration of forces and all the equipment in the direction of the capital to hit the enemy directly in the heart. Despite the brilliant victories in Poland, France and the Balkans, the Führer had to return to the old strategic errors. To divide the strike means between the 3 marshals, to lengthen the front instead of acting as a battering ram. Having recovered from the initial surprise, the Russians, operating over vast areas, made the Führer pay dearly for these mistakes. In the meantime, we were endeavouring to give the Eastern Front direct assistance, although it could only be very modest. Our corvettes and cargo ships took part in the Allied convoys which, under incredibly difficult conditions, passed through the Arctic Ocean, bringing supplies to Murmansk. As I had been unable to get the British to send the 2 light divisions formed by Lamin in the Levant to the Libyan front, I ordered General Katra in February to prepare the transfer of one of them in the direction of Iran and the Caucasus. This pleased the Russians and puzzled the British. Subsequently, since General Lamin's troops were eventually attached to the British troops fighting against Rommel, I sent to Russia a detachment of fighter aviation Normandy, which was then transformed into a regiment Normandy-Neman. This regiment fought valiantly in Russia and was the only military unit of the Western Allies, operating on the Eastern Front. On the other hand, in London, under the command of Captain Biot, arrived in London 12 officers and 102 French soldiers who managed to escape from German captivity and reach Russia, where they, however, were subjected to imprisonment. Shortly after the outbreak of the German-Soviet War, they were released and reached us with a convoy returning from Arkhangelsk via Spitsbergen. On January 20, 1942, speaking on the radio, I welcomed the restoration of Russia's military power and reaffirmed my readiness to support the present and future alliance of our 2 countries. In February, Roger Garraud, the former French envoy in Bangkok who had joined Free France, was sent to Moscow as a representative of the National Committee. For the next 3 years, Garraud, acting very intelligently, carried out useful work as our representative in Russia. Succeeded in making contact with various persons, as far as was possible under the regime there, and in bringing us valuable information. Immediately after his arrival in the country, he had meetings with the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Monotov, his deputies Vyshinsky and Lozovsky. In conversations with Garraud, they insistently emphasized the desire of his government to establish as close relations as possible with fighting France. In May, Molotov arrived in London. On May 24, I had a conversation with him, during which various questions were carefully considered. He was accompanied by Bogomolov. The impression he made on me that day, and subsequently, convinced me that in his appearance and in his character, This man was best suited to fulfill the tasks assigned to him. The Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, always serious, sparing in his gestures, alertly correct, but at the same time restrained, watching his every word, unhurriedly said what he wanted to say and listened attentively to others. He was a stranger to any kind of directness. He could not be excited, laughed at. Whatever question was being discussed, one could feel that he was perfectly familiar with it, that he had carefully noted all the new data on the subject that could be gleaned from the conversation, that he had formulated his official opinion accurately, and that he would not go beyond the preconceived guideline. Molotov must also have concluded the recent treaty with Ribbentrop with the same confidence which he now brought to the negotiations with the Western powers. Molotov, who was not and did not want to be anything other than a perfectly fitted cog in an inexorable machine, in my mind embodied a personality raised by a totalitarian system. It was a massive personality, but in the very depths of his soul, it seems, lurked a sadness. In the course of our London talks with the Soviet Foreign Minister, we had come to an agreement as to the assistance which his government and the National Committee were pledged to give each other in the near future. Free France was to push the American and British allies to open a second front in Europe as soon as possible. In addition, by her diplomatic and public activities, she was to contribute to ending the state of isolation in which Russia had long remained. For its part, the Soviet government agreed to support in Washington and London our aspirations aimed at restoring by armed struggle the unity of France and the Empire. This concerned the administration of our overseas possessions, such as Madagascar, the various so-called parallel and in fact centrifugal actions which the Anglo-Saxons were carrying out to the detriment of our cause, and the groups of the resistance movement in France. Moreover, the Soviet government recognized that no foreign power, including the USS, had the right to call on any of these groups to disobey General de Gaulle. As to the future, France and Russia agreed to join their efforts in making peace. My government, Molotov told me, is allied to the governments of London and Washington. In the interests of waging war, we must cooperate closely with them. But with France, Russia wishes to have an independent alliance independently of this. Despite the efforts made by Free France to establish ties with Washington and Moscow, the center of its activities remained London. Because of circumstances, our activities, which included military efforts, liaison with the metropolis, propaganda, information, finance, and the economy of overseas possessions, were closely intertwined with those of the British. As a consequence, we had to maintain closer relations with them than ever before. But as our movement grew, their interference in our affairs created greater and greater difficulties for us. When Russia and America entered the war, however, the position of England herself might have become difficult in an alliance with two such giants, and this might have compelled her to draw nearer to us in order to act in Europe, in the East, in Africa, and in the Pacific, in a spirit of sincere cooperation. We would gladly welcome such a change, and we have at times had the impression that some English leaders were inclined to such a policy. Anthony Eden is a case in point. This English minister, though a complete type of Englishman and minister, displayed a breadth of vision and sensitivity peculiar to a continental European rather than an Albion, and to a mere mortal rather than an official. Brought up in the spirit of old English tradition, he was nevertheless able to embrace the immediate and the new. A diplomat devoted to his country's interests, he was able to take account of the aspirations of others and to maintain a commitment to international morality amidst all the crudeness and cynicism of his time. I often had to deal with Eden, often on matters of a very unpleasant nature, and in most cases I was able to appreciate not only his brilliant mind, his deep knowledge of the case, his personal charm, but also the art with which he was able to create and maintain during negotiations an atmosphere of friendliness, which facilitated agreement, if it was possible, or relieved both sides of a sense of frustration if this agreement was unattainable. In addition, I am convinced that Anthony Eden felt a special affection for France. To her he owed much of his culture. As a politician, it seemed to him necessary as a counterweight to all the barbarism that was spreading in the world. And finally, this spirited man could not remain indifferent to the grief that had befallen the great nation. But despite Eden's good intentions, our alliance was not a rose without thorns. I am willing to admit that often Eden himself may have felt annoyed to encounter some distrust and intransigence in our midst. But the main difficulties were created from the British side. The suspicion of the Fourier Office, the claims of colonialists, the prejudices of the military, the intrigues of the intelligence service. In addition, although London's political circles were generally favourable to Free France, they were sometimes influenced by a different kind of influence. Some conservatives frowned on these Frenchmen with the Cross of Lorraine who talked of revolution. Various labour groups, on the other hand, wondered whether de Gaulle and his company were sliding toward fascism. I still remember how Attlee quietly came into my office and asked for assurances that would assuage his democratic conscience, and then, after talking to me, left with a smile on his face. Ultimately, it was up to the Prime Minister, and in his heart of hearts he could not make up his mind that Free France should become independent. Moreover, whenever our business discussions led to sharp disagreements, he made them seem like personal clashes. They grieved him the more. The stronger was our friendship. Such sentiments and feelings, combined with the methods of his political tactics, caused him fits of anger, which made our relations extremely difficult. This distinguished man had other reasons to be furious at the time. Despite the fact that the British made admirable efforts in the war, especially in submarine warfare, they suffered sometimes serious failures, which were all the more annoying that not always material superiority was on the side of the enemy. December 10, 1941. Off the coast of Malaya, Japanese planes sank the magnificent battleship, Prince of Wales and heavy cruiser Rifles, before they had time to make at least one shot. February 15, 1942, in Singapore, after a brief resistance laid down arms 73,000th British Army. In June, despite the fact that the British concentrated in the east large forces, Rommel broke through the front of the 8th Army and threw it back to Alexandria, and 33,000 British soldiers defending Tobruk capitulated with no justifiable haste. Churchill understood better than anyone the consequences of these setbacks for the course of the war, but he suffered from it primarily as an Englishman and as a soldier. It should be added that in leadership circles there were people who, acting covertly, did not hesitate to lay the blame on him for some of these failures. While the whole of England cherished Winston Churchill as the apple of the eye, some unkind statements about him could be read in the newspapers, heard in Parliament, in various committees and clubs. Under such circumstances, in the early months of 1942, Churchill had no reason to be kind and gentle to anyone, particularly me. Finally, perhaps most importantly, the Prime Minister made it a rule not to do anything important without Roosevelt's consent, although he was more than any other Englishman hurt by Washington's awkward tactics, although he could hardly tolerate the state of subordination to which American aid condemned the British Empire, although he was sickened by the tone of superiority that the President had internalized in relation to him. Churchill once and for all decided to adhere to a line of conduct that was dictated by the vital necessity of alliance with America. He was therefore wary of taking a position toward Free France that would run counter to that of the White House. And since Roosevelt was distrustful of General de Gaulle, Churchill, for his part, was forced to exercise restraint. When I arrived in London in September 1941, the Prime Minister was in an exceptionally bad mood. He was very dissatisfied with what had happened between us and the British in Syria and Lebanon. September 2, he even wrote to me that in view of my position he did not consider our meeting appropriate. On September 9, Churchill made a speech in the House of Commons inspiring concern. He recognized, of course, that of all the European powers, France occupied a particularly privileged position in the Levant, but he took the liberty of adding that it is out of the question that France should continue to maintain in Syria the same position as before the war and that even in time of war it is not possible to confine ourselves to simply replacing the influence of Vichy with that of Free France. As usual, Churchill's displeasure was accompanied by increased tension in French-English relations. For several days in succession, the London government emphatically refused to have any dealings with us and closed all doors to us. This compelled me, for my part, to order the representatives of Free France to cease for the time being to take part in the London radio programmes. Meanwhile, the pendulum swung the other way, and these troubles were soon followed by a restoration of relations. On September 15, I had a conversation with Churchill which, though badly begun, ended well. He concluded by assuring me that his government's policy in the Middle East would continue to be guided by the agreement between us at Cairo. In an effort to achieve complete clarity, I met with Eden several times in October and November. We came to an agreement on the main points. England recognized that the French mandate remained in force, and that the exercise of it was entrusted to General de Gaulle until the mandate was superseded by other agreements approved in accordance with the laws of the French Republic. That is, in fact, after the end of the war. It agreed that the declaration of independence of Syria and Lebanon by Free France should not mean a change in this legal provision. It was also established that the Littleton-de Gaulle agreements would remain the basis of Franco-English relations in the East. Indeed, when General Catroux proclaimed on September 27 the independence and sovereignty of the Syrian Republic, headed by President Sheikh Taj ad-Din, and on November 26 the independence and sovereignty of the Lebanese Republic, headed by President Alfred Nakkash, England, although she had hitherto disputed the legality of this act, immediately recognized both republics and their heads of government. At the same time, on November 28, in a letter to the General Secretariat of the League of Nations, and on November 29, in notes to the governments of the United States, all other allies and Turkey, I reported the measures taken in my name in Syria and Lebanon. These measures, the notes specified, do not affect the legal situation arising from the French Mandate Act, which must remain in force until new international agreements are concluded. This statement met with no objection on the part of the English government. Moreover, it was made on its recommendation. It was possible to think that the question was settled at least until peace was restored. In all my caution, I even wrote to our general mission in the Levant that, in my opinion, in view of the difficulties which England meets with in the Arab countries, it is in her interest, like us, to forget the petty disputes of the past and to establish the genuine cooperation of the two powers in the Muslim countries. I instructed the mission to avoid everything that might aggravate the difficulties of our allies and to use, in a spirit of sincere cooperation, every opportunity to facilitate their task, without, however, allowing any encroachment on the rights and positions of France. My calculations, unfortunately, proved unrealistic. The English, though they paid lip service to our rights, did not in fact regard them in any way. Indeed, incessant incidents continued to create Franco-English strife in the East. Such was the illegal formation by the English of cavalry units from the Druze. Such was their attempt, which we naturally opposed, to proclaim in their own name a state of siege in Jazeera, where there was unrest in connection with the Iraqi revolt. Such was their unlawful interference in the activities of the Committee for the Purchase and Distribution of Grain established by us in the Levant, and they demanded the right to participate in that committee in order to be able to interfere in the affairs of local administration. Such was General Wilson's threat, however vain, to expel some French officials he did not like. Such was the attitude of Spears, who made unfriendly and threatening statements and constantly interfered in the relations of our mission with the governments of Damascus and Beirut. General Catroux steered his ship through all the underwater reefs. Although he was inclined to make concessions and gave the British more than I would have liked, he invariably found himself in the face of fresh harassment. Hence the perpetual tension in the Levant and irritated arguments in London. In May 1942, the British began to exert pressure for the immediate holding of elections in Syria and Lebanon. Our National Committee, of course, had no objection in principle to elections to form representative governments. The governments we established were of a temporary nature. This was the case, for example, in Damascus, and I personally regret that President Hashim Bey did not remain in office. But we felt that the general elections in Syria and Lebanon should wait until the end of the war. That is, until the time when the two states were once more in a state of normalcy, when our responsibilities for the defense of those countries, arising from our mandate, would not be so difficult, and when the British would no longer be on the territory of those countries, and therefore could not influence the outcome of the elections. However, under increased pressure from Kazi, who had replaced Littleton at Cairo, General Catroux promised to hold elections in the near future, as the newspapers immediately reported. I was compelled to agree to this, although I directed that the election should be postponed. Yet it was not difficult to foresee that this question would henceforth become a source of constant Anglo-French friction. Something similar was going on elsewhere. Our allies were playing a double game around Djibouti. They left our small force, which included a battalion under Major Boulon and mechanics, to continue the blockade on land, but they themselves ended the naval blockade. From Aden on the Arabian fleet, from Madagascar on submarines and messenger ship, Iberville in Djibouti to the Vikicists arrived the necessary equipment. Meanwhile, the British themselves were negotiating with the Negus, seeking to establish their custody over Ethiopia. and the actions they took in Addis Ababa perfectly explained their inaction in Djibouti. For if Free France had succeeded, with their help, in consolidating its influence in French Somalia and in obtaining a port, a railroad, and a considerable force, it could itself have offered Abyssinia the access to the sea and the security it needed. On the contrary, while the Vichysts sat in Djibouti, the British alone held the fate of the emperor and his country in their hands. That is why Gaston Pagliuski was unable to achieve an effective blockade of Djibouti. His attempts to induce the British and the Abyssinians to conclude a trilateral treaty instead of a bilateral one were also unsuccessful. However, his efforts, as well as the work of his assistants, our commander, Lieutenant Colonel Upper, and our representative in Nairobi, the young diplomat Chancellor, led to further successful results. Thanks to their success in establishing contacts among the French and the natives in Djibouti, to their propaganda through leaflets and radio, to their relations with General Plath, the accession of Somalia to Free France was only a matter of time. On the other hand, they re-established the French representation in Addis Ababa. Our railroad rights were preserved, French secular and spiritual organizations in Abyssinia, closed during the Italian occupation, were reopened, and the French mission was reopened. Our efforts in East Africa, though somewhat belatedly, bore fruit. But suddenly a new intervention by the British at the other end of our empire brought my anxiety and indignation to the extreme. On May 5, 1942, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the press informed me by telephone that British troops had landed at Diego Suarez. Our allies had taken this French possession by force without even consulting us. Ever since Pearl Harbor, I had taken a number of steps to negotiate with the London government for the annexation of Madagascar. December 10, a meeting with General Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, December 16, a letter to Churchill, February 11. The transfer of the plan of military operations in Madagascar to the Prime Minister of England, General Brooke, and the High Commissioner of the Union of South Africa. February 19, a new letter to Churchill, and finally on April 9, a note to Eden, where in emphatic terms I raised the question of Madagascar. In all these documents I proposed to start decisive action on the island with the help of a French brigade, which could land at Majunga and move on Tananarive. If necessary, it would be supported by British aviation. At the same time, the Allies would take sabotage actions from the sea, blocking Diego. In addition, I insisted that the administration of the island be transferred to the National Committee. Meanwhile, since it seemed to me that the Union of South Africa had a direct interest in Madagascar affairs, I decided to see if the Pretoria government had any plans in this regard. At the end of 1941, Colonel Peshkov was sent to Pretoria as a representative of Free France. He personally made a very good impression on General Smuts, and I expected that if the Union of South Africa decided to take any action, its Prime Minister would not conceal it from my shrewd and tactful representative. Finally, in March, the High Commissioner in Brazzaville, Medical Service General Size, made a trip to South Africa. From his conversations with Smuts and his ministers, he got the impression that the Union of South Africa would not take any independent action in Madagascar. I therefore concentrated all my efforts in London, determined to set aside unnecessary sensitivities. Indeed, Japan's entry into the war posed a great threat to Madagascar. It had to be foreseen that sooner or later the Germans would force the Vichy government to at least allow Japanese corsairs and submarines to use bases in Madagascar. This could paralyze Allied shipping off the coast of South Africa. We were quite aware of the mood on the island from volunteers who occasionally managed to escape from Madagascar and from the crews of ships entering the island's harbours. The armistice of 1940 was received very badly on the island at first. At the time, the Governor-General of Madagascar, de Koppé, would have had little difficulty in joining Free France if he had actually followed his own statements. But he did not dare to take this step. Vichy soon replaced him by General Kiel, who, with the help of Air General Junot, did his utmost to put to sleep the will of resistance in the population. He was subsequently replaced by Governor-General Annette. Had Pétain ordered that the Japanese be allowed into Madagascar, the order would probably have been carried out. The order to resist an Allied landing would also have been carried out. So, sooner or later, the Anglo-Saxons would have had to consider seizing the island, and then, given the traditional aspirations of English policy, Free France would necessarily have to be involved in the operations. It is not difficult to understand how concerned I was about the actions and tactics of the British, especially since, on the very day the operation against Diego Soares was launched. A communique was issued in Washington stating that the United States and Great Britain express their agreement that Madagascar shall be returned to France as soon as the occupation of that island is no longer necessary for the common cause of the United Nations. So until then, Madagascar will be taken from France. To what other power, if not England or the United States, will it be handed over? In what will then be expressed France's participation in the hostilities on that island, and what would be left there of the prestige and authority of France in the future? We had to be cautious. I deliberately waited 6 days before entering into negotiations with Eden, as Eden insisted. During our conversation on May 11, the English minister showed some confusion. I assure you, he declared, that we have no intention with regard to Madagascar. We want the French authorities to continue to exercise their control over the island. What French authorities? I asked. I understood from Eden's words that the British intended to enter into negotiations with Governor-General Annette to establish a modus vivendi by virtue of which everything would remain the same in Madagascar. The Allies would continue to be stationed at Diego Soares and would keep watch over the rest of the island. I stated to Eden that this plan was unacceptable to us. Either this plan will succeed, I told him, and it will entail the neutralization of French territory under Allied custody, to which we will never consent, or it will fail, and in a few weeks you yourselves will have to carry out punitive operations in the interior of the island, which will be very much like taking over someone else's territory. I think, however, that the second option is most probable, for the Germans will be able to force the Vichy authorities to resist you. We are, Eden admitted, engaged in a matter fraught with serious complications. But I can assure you that it is the wish and hope of my government that Madagascar will eventually come under your leadership. We are prepared to make a public announcement to that effect. It was agreed that the English government would issue a communique to the following effect. With regard to Madagascar, His Majesty's government expresses the wish that the French National Committee, as the representative of France in combat, and in view of its cooperation with the United Nations, should play an appropriate part in the administration of the liberated territory. On England's part, this was an important undertaking. The very next day I stated this in a speech on the radio. For my part, I expressed confidence in the loyalty of the Allies, but I publicly rejected any compromise on Madagascar, saying that France was not willing to allow her empire to be dismembered or neutralized. France desires, I said, that on her behalf fighting France should lead and unite the efforts of the French in the war wherever that war is fought, that she should ensure the representation of her interests before the Allies as well as their defence before the enemy, that she should maintain and exercise the sovereignty of France in those of her dominions which have already been or will be liberated. On the same day I gave orders to the commander of the troops in Equatorial Africa to form a composite brigade to take part in the operations in Madagascar. But the promises of the British government and my own statements about the future role of the National Committee presupposed one problem that had by no means been solved. In reality, Vichy remained master of almost all of Madagascar. It soon became known that the British, limiting themselves to the occupation of Diego Soares, had begun negotiations with Governor-General Ain Wine. At the same time, the East African branch of the intelligence service sent there a group of agents led by Lash. These measures were contrary to the wishes of Free France. For as a result of this delayed the entry of Madagascar into active military action, strengthened the power of Aini, prolonged the split of the empire. Besides, I was apprehensive about the activities of this English political team, which we had already seen at work in the east, in Djibouti and Abyssinia. The alarming signals were not slow to appear. Peshkov, whom I wanted to send to Diego Soares to familiarize himself with the situation on the spot, was prevented from leaving South Africa. Thus, at the beginning of June 1942, over Anglo-French relations hung a dark cloud over Anglo-French relations. To all these disturbing and unpleasant for us actions of the British in Syria, Somalia and Madagascar added new facts that could not help but increase our frustration. The English mission headed by Frank, which was on the Gold Coast, sought to establish some mysterious ties with the population of the French territories in the bend of the Niger. At the same time, General Giffard, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in West Africa, informed our missions that they would have to leave Bathurst and Freetown. I had personally intended to go to Libya to inspect our troops, but received an insistent request from the English government to postpone the trip. from which I understood that I would not be provided with the means necessary for the journey. In London itself, officials, institutions, and headquarters were shutting us out by an impenetrable wall of secrecy, which suggested a distrust of us. It became obvious that the Anglo-Americans were developing at this time a plan for extensive operations in the Western Theatre of Operations. Chief of Staff of the American Army, General Marshall Lee, Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, Admiral King, spent the entire month of May in London, and they avoided meeting with me. But what the Allies were so obviously up to could not fail to affect France in the most immediate way, considering her forces, her possessions, and the population of those possessions. Nevertheless, the intention seems to have been to exclude, as far as possible, the most active part of France, Free France, from participation in affairs, to dismember her possessions and forces, and perhaps to take advantage of this dispersion to seize some or other of her territories. It was time to retaliate. It was necessary to show the Allies that Free France had joined their camp to represent France, and not to cover before the French nation their abuses and possible encroachments upon French interests. The National Committee discussed the situation at length and came to a unanimous opinion on the subject. On June 6, I instructed Charles Nick, an excellent diplomat whom the Foreign Office had seconded to us, to bring our views to the attention of Churchill and Eden. If in Madagascar, Syria, or elsewhere, I told him France, through the action of her allies, were to lose anything of what belongs to her, our direct cooperation with Great Britain, and perhaps with the United States, would be rendered indefensible. We would find ourselves compelled to end this state of affairs, and this would lead us to concentrate all forces in the liberated territories in order to continue the struggle with all the means at our disposal, but alone and in our own interests. On the same day, I telegraphed to Iboué and Leclerc, as well as to Quatreauté and informed them of this decision and urged them to be on the alert. I also ordered them to warn the Allied representatives who were with them of our decision. The result was not long in coming. Already on June 10, I was invited to Churchill. He and I had a very informative hour-long conversation, after warm compliments on the French troops, distinguished at Bir Hakeim. The Prime Minister began to talk about Madagascar. He frankly admitted that fighting France had reason to resent the manner in which the operation had been carried out. But, he added, we have no hindsight about Madagascar. We ourselves do not yet know what we shall have to undertake there. After all, the island is so huge. We'd like to settle things so that we don't get bogged down there. As if I told him, we want one thing, that Madagascar should reunite with Free France and take part in the war. To this end, as I suggested to you yesterday, we are prepared to send our troops there. You are not my only ally, replied the Prime Minister. By this he was letting me know that Washington was opposed to our involvement. In truth, I had no doubt about it. I again drew Churchill's attention to the danger to our alliance of some of the methods which are now being applied to the French Empire, and tomorrow, perhaps, will be applied to France itself. He dismissed my reproach by declaring his good intentions. I am a friend of France. I have always wished and now wish France to be a great country and to have a strong army. It is necessary for peace, for order, for the safety of Europe. I have always pursued only such a policy. That is true, I replied. Moreover, it is to your credit that after the surrender of Vichy you continued to stake on France. That French card is now called de Gaulle, and see that you do not lose it now. That would be all the more reckless at a moment when your policy is bearing fruit and when Free France has become the soul and strength of the French resistance. We started talking about Roosevelt and his attitude toward me. Don't force anything, said Churchill. See how I am. Then I bow, then again straighten up. You are allowed to do so, I substituted. For you rely on a strong state, a united nation, a united empire, strong armies, and I. What have I got? And yet, you know it, I am bound to look after the interests and future of France. It is too heavy a burden, and I am too poor to allow myself to bend. At the conclusion of the conversation, Churchill excitedly emphasized his friendly feelings toward us. We still have great difficulties to overcome, but one day we shall return to France, perhaps as early as next year. At any rate, we will go back there together. He walked me all the way out into the street, repeating, I won't leave you. You can count on me. 3 days later, Aden, in turn, found it necessary to assure me of England's disinterestedness. In regard to the French Empire in general and Madagascar in particular, he informed me that Brigadier Lash had been recalled, and that Peshkov could leave for Madagascar. "Believe me," he said with fervour, "we want to go with you hand in hand to prepare the Western Front." For some time the state of affairs was still uncertain. However, our warning was heard. It was henceforth unlikely that English arbitrariness in regard to our imperial possessions would cross certain bounds. Conditions were being created for some respite in Syria, for the reunion with us of Somalia, and finally for the flag of the Cross of Lorraine to fly over Madagascar. Besides, I was more clearly aware than ever that England would not ultimately abandon her alliance with us. Among the spectators who followed with keen interest the diplomatic play, over the course of 100 different acts of which Free France gradually took the place of France, were European governments who had emigrated to London. In 1941, the circle was widened by the arrival of the Greek king and ministers, and then the king and government of Yugoslavia. They were all very concerned about what was happening to France. Betrayed and abused in their own country by the local quislings who had seized their power, they showed deep hostility to Vichy, whose behaviour served as an excuse for collaborationists in their countries. On the other hand, although their sovereignty was not questioned by the great Allied powers, they suffered the miserable fate of the weak being dependent on the strong. Finally, they had no doubt that the revival of France would be a condition for the restoration of the European equilibrium and for their own future. They therefore followed with secret sympathy the efforts of Free France to gain her independence. On their part, we have met with the most friendly favour. In turn, we did not neglect to strengthen ties with these governments, which had been expelled from their countries, but which retained throughout the free world official representation and considerable influence. De Gaulle and his National Committee colleagues maintained relations with their ministers and officials. Our staffs and services also established contact. I personally had meetings with heads of state and responsible leaders. These meetings and conversations were of considerable benefit to us, because we were dealing with significant and authoritative people. But beneath the shell of etiquette were visible mental dramas caused by defeat and exile. Of course, by all means observing the trappings of power, these governments sought to appear calm. But deep down, amidst their cares and distresses, each of them was secretly experiencing its own deep tragedy. To tell the truth, since Russia and the United States entered the war, the Western governments no longer doubted that their countries would be liberated. But what would their countries be then? This is what my Dutch, Belgian, Luxembourgian, and Norwegian interlocutors were thinking about most of all. The noble Queen Wilhelmina, her Prime Minister, Professor Geerbrandy, her Foreign Minister, the enterprising Van Cliffens, and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands saw with despair how the Dutch East India Empire was disappearing. In spite of the unparalleled efforts of the fleet under Admiral Gelfrich and the resistance of General Ter Porten's troops in the jungles of Indonesia, Pierlot, Gut and Spaak, who constituted in the service of Belgium a triumvirate of wisdom, perseverance and political ingenuity, could not speak without bitterness of the problem of royal power. As for the Grand Duchess Charlotte, her consort Prince Felix of Bourbon-Parma, and Besque, fortunately for them a permanent minister, they never ceased to calculate the material and moral losses that Nazi domination might bring to Luxembourg. Finally, King Haakon VI, who was a model of steadfastness and faith in the future, and Traigi Lai, who showed tireless activity in all fields, grieved deeply at the sight of Norwegian merchant ships perishing. This is the sinking of our national wealth, they reiterated. Even more dramatic was the situation of Greece, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland. For if Russia's entry into the war guaranteed them the defeat of Germany, it brought them a new threat. Heads of state and ministers spoke openly about this. King George I and the head of his government, Suderas, told me about the terrible sufferings to which the Greek people were condemned by the Nazi invasion, about the resistance that the people launched against all odds, but also about how all the hungry and all the struggling were rallying around the Communist Party. At the same time, I saw how the entourage of Peter Ye, the young Yugoslav king, and even inside the cabinet, headed successively by General Simovic, Jovanovic, and Trifunovic, reflected the events that were tearing their country apart, the elevation of Croatia to the rank of a separate kingdom, of which the Duke of Spoleta was proclaimed the head, the seizure by Italy of Dalmatia and Slovenia with Ljubljana, the rivalry and soon the struggle of Tito's with General Mihailovic, who, however, led actions against the occupiers in Serbia. On the contrary, it seemed that President Benes and his ministers, Sramek Masaryk Ripka and General Inga, trusted the future policy of the Soviets. Through Bogomilov's mediation, they maintained outwardly friendly relations with the Kremlin. With their representative in Moscow, Feilinger seemed to enjoy trust and respect there. The Soviet command formed the Czechoslovak Corps from Czechs who had served in the Wehrmacht and had been taken prisoner in Russia. It was obvious that Beneš, for all his disgust for the Soviet regime, was counting on Russia above all in his efforts to restore the Czechoslovak state and his own position in Prague. Conversations with Beneš turned into informative lectures on history and politics, which he could read for a very long time without tiring either the listeners or himself. I can still hear his stories about the fate of the state, at the helm of which he stood for 20 years. This state, he said, cannot exist without the direct support of Moscow, for it must include the Sudetenland, inhabited by Germans, Slovakia, with the loss of which Hungary cannot in any way be reconciled, and Teschin, on which the Poles are charging. France is too unreliable for us to rely upon. In the future, the president concluded, we could avoid the risk of an exclusive alliance with the Kremlin, but only if France regains her position and role in Europe. Until then, what is left for me to do? That was Beneš's reasoning, but I sensed that in the depths of his soul lurked anxiety. As for the Poles, they had no doubts. In their eyes, Russia was an enemy, even if we had to fight together with her against a common enemy. In the opinion of the President of the Republic, Radzkiewicz, General Sikorski, who was at the head of the government and army, Ministers Zaleski, Raksinski, General Kukel, the defeat of Germany must inevitably be followed by the entry of Soviet troops into Poland. As to the means of curbing Moscow's claims after the victory over Germany, there was a struggle between two tendencies among the Poles. One was fear of the worst, and despair gave rise to intoxicating illusions, just as in Chopin's music, suffering gives rise to dreams. They cherished the hope that a solution would be reached in which Poland would expand westward, ceding part of Galicia and Lithuanian lands to Russia and obtaining from her a commitment not to establish her domination in Warsaw by establishing a communist government. But as soon as it came to the conclusion of an agreement, they fell into extreme agitation and began to demand the impossible, which caused indecision among the Allies and irritation among the Russians. In spite of all doubts, however, General Sikorski was determined to secure an agreement with the Russians. This courageous man was personally responsible for the fate of his country, for having opposed the policy of Marshal Pilsudski in his time, and later the arrogance of Beck and Radziwiłł, he found himself, after the catastrophe, vested with all the full power of the state, which can only be in exile. As soon as the German armies invaded Russia, Sikorski did not hesitate to re-establish diplomatic relations with the Soviets, despite the anger of the Poles. Already in July 1941, he concluded an agreement with the Soviets, according to which the partition of Poland made in 1939 by Russia and Germany was declared null, and in December he travelled to Moscow to negotiate the release of Polish prisoners of war and their shipment to the Caucasus, from where they could be transferred to the Mediterranean Sea under the leadership of General Anders. Sikorski had a long conversation with Stalin. On his return, recounting his negotiations, he portrayed to me the Kremlin ruler as a man racked with anxiety, but retaining all his shrewdness, sternness, and cunning. Stalin, Sikorski told me, agreed in principle to the conclusion of the treaty. But what he will include in this treaty himself, and what he will demand of us, will depend on the balance of available forces, that is, on whether we meet with support in the West or not, in the hour of need, who will help Poland. Only France or no one. Thus, to the accompaniment of the muffled chorus of the anxious voices of the emigrating governments, Free France succeeded. Following the English, they all recognized the National Committee in restrained terms, but they all saw in General de Gaulle a Frenchman who had every reason to speak for France. They showed this, for example, by signing with me a joint statement on war crimes, which took place on January 12, 1942, during a meeting of heads of government. On the whole, our links with the emigrating governments and the respect with which they treated us were of great help to us diplomatically, and created for us in public opinion a number of unaccountable advantages. While Anglo-Saxon public opinion was led by prominent men in the unfolding world drama, on the other hand, despite the censorship restrictions of wartime, this public opinion itself influenced governments. We therefore endeavoured to use it in our political game. I myself endeavoured to do so by exploiting the sympathy or curiosity aroused by our activities and regularly appealed to the English and American public. using tried and tested techniques. I selected from among the organizations that invited me to speak those where I could find an audience most suited to my current objectives and subject matter. As the guest of honor at a specially organized breakfast or luncheon, I would see, towards the end of the reception, professional media professionals or influential people who had come to hear me speak slowly enter the room and join the guests. Then, after listening to the traditional English greetings of the chairman, I would say what I was about to say. Unfortunately, not being able to speak English well enough, I usually spoke in French. But immediately Sustel took over. My speech, translated in advance, was distributed among those present. The press and radio in England and the United States reported the main content of my speeches. As for objectivity, I dare say it seemed to me to be very moderate on the part of the American newspapers, which sometimes made a fuss about a phrase of mine taken out of context. Nevertheless, my remarks reached the public. English newspapers never distorted my speeches, although they were not stingy in their criticism. It should be noted that the press of Latin American countries paid much attention to my speeches out of love for France, out of respect for de Gaullism, or perhaps out of a desire to displease the United States. On the whole, with the exception of a few instances of tension in our relations, when I was forbidden to speak on the pretext of military necessity, I must say that the Allied democracies have always respected freedom of speech. I spoke to the English even before I left for the East, in the spring of 1941, notably in the Foyles Literary Lancenary Club and in the French-English Parliamentary Group. After my return to London, from September of the year until June of the following year, I made successive appearances in the international press, before the workers, engineering and management staff of the English Electric Tank Works at Stafford, in the Royal African Society, in the Foreign Press Association, at the Oxford University French Club, the English Speakers Union, the City Life Club, the Public Assistance Committee for National Defence, before the municipality and prominent citizens of Edinburgh, and at a meeting arranged in Parliament for members of the House of Commons. In May 1942, I held my first press conference. On July 14, 1941, while I was in Brazzaville, the National Broadcasting Corporation of America broadcast my address to American listeners on all its radio stations. On July 8, 1942, the Columbia Broadcasting Company broadcast across America a greeting in English on behalf of our friend and ally General de Gaulle. In New York City's Central Park, a huge crowd led by Mayor LaGuardia listened to the broadcast. On July 14, I again addressed the Americans on the occasion of the French national holiday. In addition to these most important speeches, there were many others that found a sympathetic response from the audience, even though I was sometimes forced to speak without preparation. Thus, I have been invited by the municipalities of Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Glasgow, Gull, Oxford, the University of Edinburgh, the Portsmouth Naval Office, the naval shipyards at Bryam and Cowan, the toll booth works, the Hamelin factories, the editorial office of the Times, and by many invariably kind and friendly clubs. But if I sometimes varied the tone of my speeches, I always developed to my foreign audiences the same thoughts and expressed the same sentiments. I attributed the defeat of France to the obsolete system of military organization which existed at the beginning of the war in all democratic countries. France was the victim of this system because she had no such protective barrier as the ocean, and because she was left alone to fight in the vanguard. I argue that even under the oppression of the occupiers, the French nation continued to live a deep and full-blooded life, and that it would rise again, filled with the will to fight and the thirst for renewal. As proof, I cited the resistance, which was growing both inside and outside France. But I spoke of the fact that the French people were all the more sensitive to the attitude of the Allies, that they had been plunged into suffering and humiliation, that Hitler's propaganda was painting before them the prospect of rebuilding the country in an attempt to draw them into the camp of totalitarian states, and that the betrayal of Vichy was becoming all the more evident the more democratic countries respected the rights of France. It was in this spirit that I made a speech on April 1, 1942, in which I dotted all the I's which provoked sharp attacks. Let them not think, I declared, that the miracle that is battling France will exist forever in this form. Everything depends on the following. Battling France will go along with her allies on the indispensable condition that they go along with her, alluding quite explicitly to the policy of the United States, which continued to maintain relations with Vichy and conducted some dark dealings with Vichy representatives. For democratic countries to appeal to people who have ruined the freedom of France and want to establish in it a regime on the fascist model or a caricature of it is tantamount to bringing into their politics the spirit of the ill-fated Gribouille who threw himself into the water to escape the rain. I added solemnly and menacingly, in all this there is manifested a serious misunderstanding of that dominant fact which imposes itself upon the whole French question and which bears the name of revolution. For France, betrayed by the privileged groups and the ruling class, is making the greatest revolution in its history. And I exclaimed, it cannot be allowed that the so-called realism in politics, which, going from one Munich to another, has brought freedom to the very edge of the abyss, should continue to nullify the efforts and sacrifices of peoples. Henceforth our point of view was established. Free France succeeded in indoctrinating public opinion and governments that it was not only a fighter for France, but an unswerving defender of her interests. This we achieved just in time. For in the early summer of 1942, the conditions were created for a decisive turning point in the course of the war. Russia, which had withstood the first blow, went on the offensive. England, despite sending numerous reinforcements to the east, concentrated on its territory significant force. The United States was ready to transfer to the Western Front fresh armies and grandiose material reserves. Finally, France, though defeated and enslaved in the metropolis, with most of its overseas possessions in passivity, was still in a position to bring into decisive combat considerable military forces. The resources of its empire and the forces of the resistance moved just as the battle flag is widely unfurled when entering the battlefield. In the spring of 1942, I gave the name of Fighting France to what had hitherto been called Free France and officially notified the Allies of this renaming. In the coming battle, the fate of France was decided. The battlefield was to be her territory, North Africa or the metropolis. On her contribution to the common struggle would depend what she would receive after victory. But her position in the world, her national unity, the integrity of her possessions, depended on the policy of the Allies. I could have no doubt that certain persons, and quite influential ones at that, would have wished that at this decisive hour the body which was leading the struggle of France should be as dependent and insolvent as possible, and that the France in combat should be deprived of the opportunity of exercising autonomy in the events which were taking place, if it could not be entirely withdrawn. But the position she had won in the world was now sufficiently secure to be suspected from without. It was necessary, however, that our movement should be solid from within, that it should enjoy the support of the nation as it awakened. And as I waged our struggle, I thought only of whether in the trials to come, Fighting France would show enough energy, dignity, and firmness to maintain its inner strength. Would the exhausted, confused, tormented French people listen to me? Will I be able to rally the whole of France?